Welcome, IO, to Beginner's Guide to Sitting. My name is Gracia Rodriguez from the Health and Performance team. I'm excited to share with you 3 principal guides on how to sit in a healthy, efficient, and sustainable way. This work comes from Noelle Perez. She was the first Westerner to study under the famous Indian yogi Iyengar in the 1930s. Iyengar recognized postural imbalances in the Western culture and stated that Westerner center is off and out of place. This statement has inspired the beginnings of Miss Press's teachings decades ago. Along the lines of these teachings, one can go as far as to say, we have lost the art of sitting. Because the truth is, it's not necessarily how much we sit, it's how we sit. People tend to round out their backs when they sit, which places the spine in an inefficient position. There are 2 telltale signs: shoulders curve over and buttocks curve under. One of the problems is that we tend to fix the upper body. We often hear, sit up straight, and most of us stick our chest out, which creates a back bend in our spine. Now, instead of focusing on your chest and shoulders, we could bring our attention to our pelvis. In other words, our buttocks. The most important thing to change to create efficient alignment is your pelvis position. It's like a stack of toy blocks. If the blocks at the bottom aren't sturdy and stable, then the blocks at the top will have no chance. Now that we have brought our attention to our pelvis, let's familiarize ourselves with a few bony landmarks, as we will refer to this in our practice. I like anatomy, and here's your free anatomy lesson for today. I'd like to introduce you to your pelvis. The pelvis is very important because this is where the upper body connects as well as the lower body. So any movements happening from this bone will affect the upper body and the lower body. So let's point out a few bony landmarks here. Now, first one, of course, is your sit bones, right here. Left and right. Reason why it's sit bones because this is where we sit. We want to place our weight on these bones. We call this the ischial tuberosity. Then we also have the pubic bone right in the center here in front. Then we have our hip bones right here. This is the bony projection facing. It's in front of our pelvis. Then as we look at the back, then we have here the remnant of a tail, which we call the tailbone, or also known as your coccyx. So if we were designed as cats or dogs, then we want to be able to wag that tail. Then, of course, we have the sacrum, which supports, of course, where the rest of the spine attaches to, and it connects to the pelvis. Okay, so now we have been familiarized with this pelvis. I also consider this as the bowl that carries water, and we want this bowl to make sure that the water doesn't spill. I will be referring to the bowl when we get to our first practice. Now that we are familiar with this, we're clear, let's move on to our first guide. And now that we're clear, let's go to the first guide, shall we? The first guide is untuck your pelvis and let your tail wag. So when we tuck our pelvis and sit on our tails, the spine loses its support and results in rounding the back like a C shape or cashew nut shape. This is an inefficient way of sitting, and it's not sustainable and can often lead to a variety of back problems. To figure out how to shift your pelvis into a healthier position and straighten the curved spine, we need to position the pelvis in a way that we could wag our tails, our imaginary tails. In other words, we need to untuck our pelvis. Now, I would like to invite you and practice with me. So let's sit on a chair. Then place a hand under each buttock with your palms up and feel the bony bump of the sit bones. You know when someone sits on your lap and says, "You've got a bony butt." Now shift the weight side to side to look for those bones. You want to make sure that you're really putting all that weight into your hands. Feel the shelf of that sit bones. Now that you have it, let's go ahead and try tilting our pelvis. Remember, our pelvis is like a bowl, and we want to keep that water in that bowl. So let's tilt our pelvis forward. So when you tilt your pelvis forward, now what happens is that you're spilling the water in front, and you lose contact of that sit bones. It's now more towards your pubic bone. Notice. How does that feel? Now let's go ahead and tilt the pelvis backwards, towards the back, and round, really round your back. So, and sitting on your tailbone. How does that feel? Now I'm sitting on my tail and I don't feel as much of my sit bones, and I'm spilling the water towards the back. I don't want that. Now let's go ahead and bring that bowl back to the center so we keep the water in and sitting on our sit bones. Now we can wag our tail too. All right, so how does that feel? Feels good. Great, so go ahead and untuck your hands. So now that we have a good idea of how to establish a healthy pelvis position, now let's move on to our second guide. So the second guide is keep your spine on the axis. Now, what does it look like and what does it mean to keep your spine on the axis? So imagine a long pin entering from the top of your head all the way down to your spine and exiting out to your sacrum, all the way to your tailbone. This pin also represents the axis. And the pin would effectively prevent your spine from bending forward, backward, side to side, but would allow the spine to twist in a transverse plane. Now, with the pelvis in a healthy position and the spine kept on the vertical axis, our bones support our body weight, and the core muscles provide secondary support, not the primary support. Now, why is it important also to keep the spine on the axis? Keeping the spine on the axis creates balance in the muscles. So we have our abdominals here and the back muscles supporting each other, and they are in the resting position. Another thing about keeping the spine on the axis is that it facilitates the efficient functioning of internal organs, and it also offers the least amount of stress placed upon the structures. And keep in mind, with the spine on the axis, the bones are stacked, so it is in the strongest position. So if you want to see who is the perfect example of living on the axis, look at toddlers. Toddlers are the best example of living on the axis. So if you ever see a toddler sit down, copy them. Now, should we give it a try? So we'll stay standing. So to make sure we find or keep our spine on the axis, let's place our fingers. You can use your middle finger or your index finger and to place them in your hip bone. Remember that hip bone, the bony projection in front of your hip. Then you'll use your thumb and place the thumb at the edge, bottom edge of your ribs. So it should look like this. Right, so now when you have your fingers positioned, stand hip width apart, and we're going to slowly bend forward. So let's bend forward. Great. Just go as far as you can where it's comfortable for you. All right, so let's go back, standing up straight. Now let's do that one more time. Pay attention to your fingers and bend forward and back up. Now, why am I saying this? What are we trying to notice here? Now, if you're keeping your spine on the axis, the distance between the fingers, your fingers should be the same. But once you move your spine off the axis, like when I do this, when I start rounding my back, now I notice that my fingers come together and the distance becomes smaller. When you go back up and you notice that the distance becomes longer, then you might be arching your back. So now you have moved your spine off the axis. Keeping the spine on the axis means that maintaining distance between these two. So I hope that would serve as a guide in keeping the spine on the axis. And when the spine is off the axis, muscles would contract. So when we round our back, the abdominal muscles would contract, and of course, your back muscles would lengthen. And this is where inefficient alignment begins. And this is when muscles begin to take the job of the bones. Now, when you practice, notice how it feels to keep the spine on the axis and when you're shifting your pelvis in a healthy position. So, any changes that you might notice, awareness is the key. Finally, we have come to our third and last guide, bending from the hip bones, not from your waist. You might wonder, why do we need to bend over when we go sit down? Well, the truth is, every time we bend somewhere. And where we bend determines on how we will sit. To keep your pelvis untucked, we need to bend over properly when we sit down. So if we bend from the hips, we're more likely to sit in an efficient way with our pelvis untucked. If we bend at the waist, then we will likely sit on our tails with a C or cashew-shaped spine. So would you like to practice on how to bend in a healthy way? Feel free to follow along as I give the instructions. First, stand up, hip width apart. Then place your fingers at the hip bone, so you can use your thumbs. Then slide your fingers or your thumb about 1.5 inches down, landing into your hip crease. Now push your fingers backward. Push your thumb or fingers backwards and hinge from your hip. And poke your buttocks out with your imaginary tail. Think of your imaginary tail wagging. And imagine that at the base of your spine. Now remember to keep your spine on the axis. Remember to keep your spine on the axis. And then bend as far as you can till you begin to feel the stretch in your hamstrings. And notice your quads relax. So stretch in your hamstrings and notice your quads relax. So you have to bend as far as you can. And then you're going to slowly lower your buttocks on the seat and landing on your sit bones, keeping the spine stacked. So let's do that. Let's give it a try one more time. So I'm going to stand up, hip width apart, placing your fingers into your hip bone, sliding down about 1.5 inches, landing into your hip crease. Push backward and hinge from your hip, bend as far as you can, and letting your buttocks poke out with your imaginary tail and keeping your spine stacked. Now soften your shoulders and your chest by letting your rib hang down. So this will ensure alignment in your spine, and bend as far as you can. Then land on your sit bones, and then you are sitting efficiently. How does that feel? How is that? I know it takes time to get used to the bending, but with practice, I know you can do it. In conclusion, let's be reminded that once upon a time, we were toddlers and also living in alignment. At some point, as early as age 3, we began modeling posture, and we may have adapted to non-ideal postures and ineffective patterns of tension. This brings us back to where I began talking about the famous Indian yogi, Iyengar's observation about posture and culture. Posture is cultural, and we pick these postures from our parents, family, friends, teachers, etc. Though it takes time to release and undo these patterns of tension, it can be done and eventually integrated into daily life. Remember these 3 principal guides to achieve healthy, efficient, and sustainable way of sitting. Untuck your pelvis so the tail can wag. Keep your spine on the axis and bend from your hip joints, not from the waist. When you find yourself tucking your tail and rounding your back, I encourage you to stand up, bend from your hips, pull your tail out, keep your spine on the axis, and sit on your sit bones. And again, it's not how much we sit, it's how we sit. Thank you for your time and for watching.